Spring Festival, as the Lunar Chinese New Year celebrations popularly known, is falling on this Friday. But with the worries over the pandemic, consumer spending during the festival will likely take a hit. So various stimulus measures are in place. For example, in Beijing, the capital city, some $1.5 million in digital currency test will be handed out during the festival. It's fueling the ongoing shift of Chinese consumer preferences toward e-commerce and online entertainment and education for over the past decade. The pandemic did accelerate the trend, proving to be a boon to companies that serve the stay-at-home economy. How deep and wide is the pandemic's impact on the Chinese holiday economy? Let's loop in our panelists. They will also have something to say about the future of the Chinese economy. About the economy in Beijing, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Also in Beijing, Xu Sitao, Chief Economist of Deloitte China. Last but not least, in Brussels, Daniel Groh, Member of the Board and Distinguished Fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies. Let me ask you, though, about the holiday season. Now, with the Spring Festival holiday season, usually it is time Chinese consumers spend in a big way. This time, though, out of precaution, not many people would travel, not as much as 1 billion people on the move. So, Xu Sitao, tell me more about what can we predict about this month, the month of February?
I think this month should be okay. First quarter this year is going to be way above double-digit economic growth rate. And of course, we're in the mid of the Chinese New Year, as you can see, and you still get usual traffic in Beijing, which is very different from what we have seen in past years. So that cannot be measured in terms of dollar and cents. But I would say most people, they take the view this is necessary, and because in order to protect greater goods, I think people are rather to celebrate the Chinese New Year where they are instead of their hometown.
Are you going to buy much during the festival yourself? You and your family?
I don't see any changes of consumption pattern, but
Really?
Of course, pandemic has forced consumers to really accelerate their adoption of digital applications. So you try to buy things online.
Yeah, more people went dining out, right, during the ordinary years. So this time, maybe not, especially during the New Year's Eve. The New Year's Eve dinner is extremely important for the Chinese, and it's one of the highest price tag usually for any restaurant. And this year, it's going to be quite different. And also, we have seen, the traveling plans people have, Mr. Xu. Earlier, it's anywhere in the world, be as big as your dream. However, this year, well, anywhere in the suburbs of the city you're living in. So it's a very different story, isn't it, Mr. Xu?
Yes. Well, I mean, everyone knows hospitality industry is being affected.
Yeah.
But at least China is not Spain or Thailand. The economy is not that exposed to tourism. Some of the interesting changes we have seen, really, people who were born in the 90s or even late 90s, they are a lot more enthusiastic. So this is a so-called consumption upgrade of young Chinese consumers. That trend has been extremely pronounced.
What are they spending on?
Well, many hotels, they want to have a different experience. They got more free spirit. They are more willing to try new things.
Yeah.
They are less frugal. They're more confident.
Professor Liu, have you ever have some new thoughts about your holiday plan?
Our university has high recommendation that without substantial legitimacy, you do not really leave Beijing. So I'm a very obedient citizen on the campus, so I have to stay.
Mr. Guo, I want to have the input from you first. You've been traveling to China frequently before the pandemic. Tell me more about the Chinese economy from your observation over the past year.
The Europeans can only be envious of the success of China, its high growth rates, and also how it has overcome the pandemic. And that is why actually Europe at this point in time, when its own economy is very weak, its own demand is very weak, is relying heavily on exporting more to the Chinese market, which is the only market in the world which is still expanding.
Well, Mr. Xu, your take.
The Chinese economy is clearly on a roll, and I very much echo the sentiment from our colleague in Belgium, mainly because consumers are extremely resilient, interest rates low, virus for practical purpose has been eradicated. Now global recovery is gathering momentum. That's boding well for the Chinese economy. Again, with a large fiscal stimulus looming in the US, that's also boding well for the global recovery. So in a nutshell, the Chinese economy is likely to sustain its recovery strongly.
Wow. We have two panelists already blowing the horn, suggesting this is going to be big time for Chinese economy. Mr. Liu, Professor, what do you think?
Well, in addition to the optimism expressed by our two guests, I should say that Chinese economy is also experiencing structural changes. One, of course, is because of the impact of the pandemic, where the tourism, hospitality industry, and all human-intensive industries are being adversely affected, which is taking the same pattern as globally. And the other is the artificial or politically engineered changes that is going on. We are shifting from a more of a efficiency-driven and a scope-driven economy now into a more innovation-driven economy. And yes, we are looking at the brighter side of the picture, but in the meantime, there are a lot of hurdles in the innovation process because companies may not really be able to cope with the development trends, so therefore they fall out.
Looking up from afar, will the service job and the labor job be much impacted in the Chinese economy as a result of the pandemic that is still going on?
Actually, in China, little might change because the virus has been eradicated, and in a year or so, people will feel confident to travel again. But we have to keep in mind the travel and leisure industry within China is really of secondary importance. And that's different elsewhere, as was said already, Thailand, Spain, and so on, very much depend on the travelers for their economy. And therefore, they made a mistake. They opened too early.
Yeah.
And that's why we still have the virus in Europe. So I think the Chinese are doing well, staying at home this time so that they can travel again tomorrow.
But Mr. Guo, here's the question. If we don't open our national border, of course, at the time of being safe, then there's going to be huge problems because right now we have enough money, everywhere in the world almost have enough money that we can consume right now at a time of crisis. But this crisis, if it continues, 1 year, even 2 years, that's going to have a huge dampening effect on the global economy. Even China blossom on its own for 1 year, it doesn't mean that it would be able to do so if it lasts 2 years or 3 years.
It is true that, of course, China also depends on a well-functioning world economy. If there's no growth abroad, it's more difficult for China to grow. But we have to keep in mind there's, so to speak, two economies.
Yeah.
There's the manufacturing sector, trade in goods, which is actually doing fine, which is coming back. And even in Europe, industry is doing well. So I think trade will actually blossom this year. There will be no problems in that direction. It's just the very local services sector, which is much more important in parts of Europe, which will have difficulties for some time. But I think if you keep the borders open for goods, which they are, then both China and the rest of the world can at least participate in strong growth in manufacturing and trade.
Professor Liu, there are various occasions in which China is trying to showcase to the rest of the world that it's still opening up and probably opening up even more. And there are buying and purchasing from the rest of the world, the China Shanghai Import Expo, and you are going to see Hainan's Expo later this year, Consumption Expo that's called. But will this engine work? To what extent can China's engine work for the rest of the world?
Well, China continues to contribute to the larger share of the global growth, and we have been contributing to the added growth by roughly 30%. And now with the pandemic looming large, we are able to contribute more because we are able to manage it under better control. But in the meantime, China continues to enjoy the trade surplus with over 100 countries. So therefore, China wanted to show it's not really Chinese intention to enlarge such sort of trade gap. So therefore, over the past few years, we have stepped up the imports from most of the trading partners, and particularly also we are looking at Africa and Latin America, where we are also offering the a kind of general preferential treatment and even zero tariff for the imports of both bulk material and also manufactured products. And that's also part of the country's global responsibility that China is trying to paint.
So now, one of the biggest things about the Chinese economy is the platform economy. That's been built by some of the biggest tech companies over the past decade. We know, Mr. Xu, the latest guideline has been issued regarding the practices on the platform economy, anti-monopoly measures particularly. How are we going to see the prospect of these platforms in the latter half of this year? How is it likely to have an impact on the growth and also the direction of the Chinese economy?
All these platforms are very powerful. In fact, if we look at them globally, only China and United States have such platforms because of the size of the market. In China, of course, consumers are more willing to embrace them because of less concern with the privacy. However, the concern is for some of these platforms, they may compete with subsidies from other business units. So this is so-called unfair competition.
Right. Now,
for most of the mom and pop shops, clearly they cannot compete with platforms.
Mr. Guo, we see that thing going on, legislations against the monopoly, also inside Europe. Of course, it might not be about the European platforms, but rather about American platforms operating in Europe. How do you see, new guidelines and new measures, new policies these days going on in different parts of the world toward the platform economy? In China's case, where is it?
It's that's really a difficult problem for European policymakers, because there's a popular demand to do something about the power of the American platforms. But at the same time, they're indispensable for the functioning of the European economy, and they're indispensable for many consumers. And the consumers right now are not paying anything. They're paying with their data. And European regulators will have to be very careful not to deprive European consumers of the benefits of the platform, but at the same time to rein in their powers. So for the time being, we're talking about very small taxes on digital transactions, which might be coming. But I don't think that European regulators can go much further for the simple reason that there's no European platform.
Do the Europeans need to have a platform of its own?
I think it would be nice if one could have one, but unfortunately there you need a European Zuckerberg, a European entrepreneur, and you will need an integrated European market. And so far we don't have really, in that sense, an integrated market, because In Germany, the consumer protection measures are a little bit different from France and from Italy.
Yeah.
All the business conditions are a little bit different, and therefore it's very difficult to have a pan-European entrepreneur of the kind you have either in China or in the United States.
Professor Liu, what about the platform economy? It's been so ingrained in the Chinese economic momentum now. But at the same time, anti-monopoly is a big thing that you see around the world. So what is the degree to do the job? That would be a very tricky question.
This type of innovation is really due to the deregulation process. But yes, it's market-driven. Look at the shared biking system by the Beijing municipality. People do not really pay attention to it. But shares bikes, run by private firms are really thriving despite of the reshuffling of different type of ownership. So therefore, we should be grateful to the convenience and also low cost offered by those private platforms. But of course, in the meantime, when they grow large enough and when they are really there to form a sort of monopoly or oligopoly, the government will have to do something to tame them. But to eliminate them and to have a dramatic shift of the policy towards and even public opinion towards the creators and managers of the platform is really not fair enough.
Well, my final question for all of you, what is really driving now the Chinese economy, particularly now? Professor Xu, Mr. Xu.
I would say young consumers.
As simple as that. You ruled all of us out. Is that what you're trying to say?
Younger consumers, those who were born in late 80s or 90s.
Okay. We see a very flexible economist. Thank you. Mr. Guo, what's your take? What's going to drive the Chinese economy? What is really driving the Chinese economy?
I think my colleague is right. It used to be that the Chinese economy was driven by investment, especially heavy infrastructure investment. And that should be declining now. And it's the younger consumers who should splurge a bit. And if they can do that, then they can usher a new period of consumption-driven growth.
If you conquer the young consumers, you conquer the world, as they say. Huh? Now, Professor Liu?
I would identify two major fundamentals. One is the continued infrastructure development. Now we call it new infrastructure development, from roads and ports now into the telecommunication system.
Yeah.
And the other is the continued urbanization process, which generates consumption and shift also the industrial structure. And the third is the anchor as Chinese industrial cluster that are there to be highly competitive. So therefore, it's really the most attractive part to global investment and global traders.
All right. For now, I want to thank the three of you joining us, and I want to say Happy Chinese Lunar New Year to every one of you and your families.